"You are no longer Kiowa," the elder said, and the fire between them cracked like a gunshot. Little Fawn did not flinch. She had known this moment was coming since the night her brother died with an arrow meant for someone else in his chest, and the council needed a name to carry the blame. Hers was the name they chose. She stood in the center of the circle, wrapped in a blanket that no longer belonged to her, while 40 faces watched her the way people watch a fire they are glad is finally out. The wind carried wood smoke and the bitter tang of sage across the camp, and somewhere behind her a dog barked once and went silent, as if even the animals understood that something was ending. "You will take nothing," the elder continued. "You will speak to no one. By sunrise you will be gone." She had a knife. She had the clothes on her back. She had a small leather pouch at her hip, and inside it, a single silver button that had belonged to her mother. The only thing they had not thought to take, because they did not know it was there. By midnight she was walking south with no fire and no horse, only the cold pressing against her like a hand at her throat, and the stars close enough to touch and utterly indifferent to her. She did not cry. She had promised herself, somewhere around the 3rd mile, that she would not give the wilderness the satisfaction. 40 miles south, in a valley cut through by a shallow creek, Ethan Cole was burying his second horse in 2 months. The ground was hard as iron, and his shoulders ached from the digging, and he did not stop to wipe his face even when the sweat ran into his eyes and stung like salt in a wound. Drought had taken the grass. Drought had taken the wells down to mud. And whatever was left after the drought, the wolves seemed determined to finish. He was 31 years old and alone on 400 acres that had once belonged to a family of 5, and some nights the silence of his own house pressed down on him worse than any weather. He heard her before he saw her. A small, ragged sound, half breath and half moan, coming from the brush along the creek bed. His hand found the rifle propped against the fence post out of habit more than fear. He had learned out here that anything could be a threat, and anything could also be dying. It was the second one. She was folded into the shadow of a cottonwood. Her lips cracked white. One leg bent wrong beneath her. Blood dried black along a gash at her temple. Her eyes opened when his boot cracked a twig, and for one long second neither of them moved. He saw fear in her face, sharp and immediate, the fear of someone who has learned that strangers rarely mean well. Then, just as fast, he saw her decide something, that she was too weak to run, too weak to fight, and that whatever came next, she would meet it with her chin raised. That was the thing he would remember later, when he tried to explain to himself why he did what he did next. Not her beauty, though she was beautiful in the way that survival makes a person beautiful, stripped down to only what mattered. It was the chin, raised, even half dead in the dirt. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said low, the way he'd talk to a spooked horse. She said something back in a language he didn't know, 3 words, sharp as a slap, and he understood the meaning even without the words. "Don't touch me." "All right," he said, and crouched instead, keeping distance between them. "All right, we'll do this your way." He left water beside her, and a strip of jerky, and walked 20 feet off to sit with his back against a rock, rifle across his knees, watching the tree line instead of her, giving her the privacy to decide whether to trust him. Took an hour. He watched from the corner of his eye as her hand crept out, closed around the canteen, and drank like she hadn't had water in days. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge, she still hadn't spoken another word to him. But she hadn't run either, mostly, he suspected, because she couldn't. When he finally approached again, slow, hands open, and gestured toward his house with a tilt of his head, she watched him for a long moment. Then, wincing, she let him help her up. Neither of them knew yet what that single decision would cost. Word traveled fast in a valley with only a dozen ranches in it, and by the second morning Ethan's nearest neighbor, a broad, sunburned man named Garrett Voss, was standing in his yard with 2 riders behind him and a look on his face like he'd smelled something rotten. Heard you got yourself an Indian girl in that house, Voss said. Heard wrong, Ethan said. Got myself an injured person in that house. Same as I do for anybody bleeding on my land. She's not anybody, Cole. She's Kiowa. You know what they did to the Hendersons 2 counties over. I know what somebody did. Don't know it was her. Ethan kept his voice even, though his jaw had gone tight enough to ache. She's got a busted leg and a head wound, and she hasn't said 10 words to me. She's not raiding anybody. Voss's eyes slid past him, toward the house, toward the window where a shadow moved and then went still. She was listening, Ethan realized, and probably understood more English than she let on. Town's nervous, Voss said. Cattle's been run off from the Hollis place. Folks are saying it's her people, come looking for her. Then folks ought to find proof before they find a rope, Ethan said. You come here again about this, you knock on the door and say it to my face instead of my fence line. It was not the safe thing to say. He understood that, watching Voss's face harden and his riders shift in their saddles. The kind of shift that meant a story would be told tonight over supper about the Cole boy who'd gone soft, or gone strange, or gone worse. Voss spat once in the dirt, near enough to Ethan's boot to be a message, and rode off with his men trailing behind him like smoke. Ethan stood in the yard a long while after they'd gone, feeling the weight of a decision he'd already made without fully choosing it. Inside, little Fawn sat rigid on the edge of the cot he'd made up for her near the stove, her splinted legs stretched out stiff in front of her. She had understood every word through the thin wall. Her people, as if she had people left who would come looking, as if the tribe that cast her out into the dark with nothing would send riders to burn a rancher's cattle over her. She almost laughed. It came out instead as something closer to a cough, bitter and short. They think you're mine, Ethan said, coming through the door, reading her face correctly for the first time. Your tribe, think they're out raiding on your account. They are not my tribe, she said. Her English was careful, each word placed like a stone in a stream she wasn't sure would hold her weight. Not anymore. He waited. He'd learned, in 2 days, that she did not fill silences she wasn't ready to fill. They cast me out, she said finally, looking at the stove instead of at him. My brother died. They needed a reason. I was the reason. Her hand went, unconsciously, to the small pouch still tied at her hip, the one thing she'd kept hidden even from him. I have no people. Not there. Not anywhere. Something in Ethan's chest tightened. Recognition more than pity. He knew what it was to stand in the wreckage of a family and be the one left holding the blame for staying alive. Then it's a damn lie they're chasing, he said. And I already told Voss as much. She looked at him then, really looked, searching his face for the angle, the price, the thing men always wanted in exchange for kindness. She found something that unsettled her more than cruelty would have. He didn't seem to want anything at all. Why, she said slowly, would you tell that to your own kind? For a stranger? Ethan considered the question longer than she expected. Because I buried 2 horses this month and a wife 2 years before that, he said, quiet, and I've had my fill of watching things die because everybody around them was too scared to help. He met her eyes. You're not dying on my land. Not from a wound, and not from a lie neither. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, carrying with it the distant, unmistakable sound of hoofbeats on the ridge road. Not Voss returning, but something farther off, something that made the horses in the corral pull hard against their tethers and scream. Little Fawn's whole body went still, listening the way a deer goes still. Someone is coming, she said. And it is not for cattle. The riders came down out of the hills at dusk, when the light was long and orange and made every shadow twice its size, and Ethan counted 6 of them before he lost count, worrying about which ones carried rifles. Get inside, he said to Little Fawn, but she was already at the window, and what he saw on her face stopped him cold. Not fear this time, but recognition. Kiowa, she breathed. That is standing Elk's paint horse. In front. Your people, not mine. Her voice hardened. My brother's rival. He wanted to lead the council after my brother died. He is not here for cattle, Ethan Cole. He is here because a banished woman sheltering with a white rancher is worth more to him than any raid. Proof that I betrayed the tribe twice over. The riders reined up at the edge of the yard, and one man rode forward alone, broad-shouldered, a red sash at his waist, eyes that moved over the house like a man counting what he intended to take. He called out something in Kiowa, sharp and formal, and Little Fawn's hand tightened white-knuckled on the windowsill. He says, she translated, "Lo, that I am to be returned. That harboring me is an act against his people, and he will burn what needs burning to correct it." Ethan's rifle was already in his hands. "Tell him this is my land, and nobody's burning anything on it. Ethan, tell him." She did, her voice steadier than she felt, and Standing Elk's answer was to raise one hand. And behind him, 2 riders broke off toward the barn with torches already lit. What happened next happened fast, the way violence always does, compressing minutes into heartbeats. Ethan fired once into the air, a warning, not a killing shot, because some part of him still believed this could end without blood. It bought him nothing. A rider's torch arced through the dusk and caught the dry hay stacked against the barn wall, and flame climbed the old wood like something starving. Little Fawn moved before he could stop her. Out the door and into the yard, shouting in Kiowa, placing herself. Legs splinted, barely able to stand, between the burning barn and the house, between Ethan and 6 armed riders. Standing Elk's horse reared at the sight of her, and for one suspended moment the entire yard held its breath. "You have no right to punish him for my banishment," she called out, and Ethan, understanding only her tone and not her words, understood enough. "I chose to stay. If there is shame here, it is mine to carry, not his to burn for." Standing Elk's eyes narrowed. He said something short, cutting, and gestured toward her with obvious contempt. He says, "I have no right to choose anything." She translated for Ethan without turning, her voice flat with old pain. He says a woman without a tribe has no rights at all. "Funny," Ethan said, stepping up beside her despite everything, rifle steady, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. "Where I come from, that's exactly backward." The barn groaned behind them, timbers cracking, sparks spiraling up into a darkening sky, and for a moment the whole scene held there. 6 riders, 2 people standing shoulder to shoulder against a wall of fire, the smell of burning hay and horse sweat and fear thick enough to choke on. Then one of Standing Elk's men shouted a warning. Riders, more riders, coming fast up the road from the direction of town. Voss and his men drawn by the smoke and the gunfire, riding hard with torches of their own and rifles already up. Standing Elk looked at the approaching lights, did the arithmetic of a fight he could no longer win clean, and wheeled his horse hard. "This is not finished," he said, in English this time, so there could be no mistranslation, no mercy of misunderstanding. And then he and his riders vanished back into the dark hills as fast as they'd come. The barn collapsed in on itself with a sound like a held breath finally let go, and Little Fawn's legs, which had held her through 6 armed men and a burning building, finally gave out. Ethan caught her before she hit the ground. He carried her inside and laid her on the cot, and for a long while neither of them spoke, listening instead to Voss and his riders outside, dousing the last embers of the barn, their voices low and uncertain now, the earlier suspicion burned out of them by the sight of a woman who'd stood between fire and a stranger's house rather than run. "You could have let them take you," Ethan said finally, kneeling beside the cot, checking the splint on her leg with careful hands. "Would have been easier. Would have kept my barn standing, probably." "Your barn," she said, "is not worth more than a debt." "What debt?" She was quiet a moment, staring at the ceiling, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost its careful formality, worn thin by exhaustion into something rawer. "You gave me water when I could have died," she said. "You told a man to his face that I was not a raider, when it would have cost you nothing to let him believe otherwise. That is a debt I do not forget, Ethan Cole. My people forget nothing either, but they remember debts as grudges. I would rather remember mine as gratitude. He didn't have an answer for that right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out something small, wrapped in a handkerchief gone soft with age. A woman's wedding ring, plain gold, worn thin at the band. My wife's, he said, before she could ask. Fever took her the second winter we were married. I keep it because, hell, I don't rightly know why anymore. Habit, maybe. Or because letting it go feels like letting her go twice. Little Fawn's hand went, unconsciously, to the pouch at her hip, and this time she did not stop herself. She loosened the leather cord and drew out the single silver button, turning it in the firelight so it caught the glow like a small coin of memory. My mother's, she said, from a coat a trader gave her years before I was born. It is the only thing they did not think to search for, the night they cast me out. I have carried it as though it were her hand. She looked up at him. You keep a ring because it is what remains of someone who loved you. I keep a button because it is what remains of someone I loved who is no longer permitted to claim me. Perhaps that is not so different. No, Ethan said quietly. I don't reckon it is. Outside, Voss appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, looking suddenly much older than his sunburn suggested. Cole, he said, I owe you an apology. And his eyes moved to Little Fawn, and something like shame crossed his face. Mum should have known better than to judge a person by the worst of their own kin. You were afraid, Little Fawn said simply. Fear makes fools of good men as often as bad ones. I do not hold it against you so long as it does not return. Voss nodded, chastened, and left them to help his men finish putting out the last of the smoldering barn timbers. When the house was quiet again, Ethan sat by the stove and Little Fawn watched him from the cot, the silver button still warm in her palm. Standing Elk will come back, she said. He does not forgive being made small in front of his own men. Then we'll be ready, Ethan said. But not tonight. Tonight you sleep and I'll keep watch and tomorrow we'll figure the rest. Why, she asked again the same question from 2 nights before, but softer now. Would you keep choosing this? Choosing me? I am nothing to your people. Less than nothing to mine. Ethan considered the fire for a long moment before he answered. Where I come from, he said, a man doesn't get to decide who's worth saving by what tribe or color they're born into. He decides by what's in front of him, a person drowning, or a person standing tall with a busted leg between a burning barn and 6 armed riders. He met her eyes, steady. I know what I saw. That's worth more to me than what anybody else thinks it should mean. For the first time since he'd found her in the brush by the creek, Little Fawn smiled, small, tired, but real. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the last of the smoke away south, toward the hills where Standing Elk had disappeared, and toward whatever reckoning was still waiting to come. Standing Elk returned 11 days later at dawn, with fewer riders than before but a harder look in his eye, the look of a man who has decided that pride is worth more than caution. He found Ethan waiting for him in the yard, alone, rifle held loose but ready, and Little Fawn standing on the porch behind him, no longer leaning on a splint, her chin raised the same way it had been raised the night Ethan first found her. You have had 11 days to reconsider, Standing Elk called out. Return her, and there need be no more fires. She's not mine to return, Ethan said. She's not property. Not yours to reclaim and not mine to keep. She's a person, and she gets a say in her own life, same as anybody. Standing Elk's eyes moved to her. You would choose exile permanently? Over your own blood? Little Fawn stepped down off the porch, slow and deliberate, and walked until she stood beside Ethan in the yard, close enough that the message could not be mistaken by anyone watching. My blood cast me out for a death I did not cause, she said, her voice carrying clean across the yard, steady in a way it had not been 11 nights ago. I have grieved that loss. I will not grieve it twice by returning to men who use grief as a weapon against me. She looked at Standing Elk without flinching. You did not come for justice. You came because a woman who refused your authority is a wound to your pride that has not healed. I am sorry for your pride, Standing Elk. I am not sorry for my choice. For a long moment, nothing moved in the yard except dust stirred by a rising wind. Then, from the ridge road, came the sound of more riders. Not Voss this time, but nearly a dozen ranchers from 3 neighboring spreads. Men who had heard the story of the burned barn and the woman who'd stood her ground, and who had decided, in the particular way that hard men sometimes do, that the story had made up their minds for them. They fanned out along the fence line, rifles visible but not raised, a silent wall of witnesses. Standing Elk looked at the numbers arrayed against him, looked once more at Little Fawn's unbroken stance, and understood, the way men like him eventually must, that some battles cost more than they are worth to win. Then let it be known, he said finally, bitterness thinning into something almost like respect, that she chose this. Not that it was taken from us. Let it be known, Little Fawn answered, that I was never yours to take in the first place. He turned his horse and rode north, and did not come back. The barn was rebuilt before the first snow, with lumber Ethan bought and labor that half the valley showed up to give, unasked, Voss chief among them, working with an intensity that looked a good deal like penance. Little Fawn worked alongside them, her leg fully healed by then, teaching 2 of the ranchers' wives how to tan hide the Kiowa way, trading stories across a divide that had, for one violent week, threatened to swallow them all. She never went back to her tribe, but she built something new in its place. Not a replacement, she was careful to say, but its own thing entirely, rooted in the valley, in the rebuilt barn, in the small ceremonies she and Ethan invented for themselves. A shared meal each dusk, a silver button and a gold ring kept together now in the same small box on the mantel, 2 halves of 2 different griefs that had somehow, against all odds, become one shared piece. They married the following spring, in a ceremony that borrowed from both their worlds and belonged fully to neither, a blessing spoken in Kiowa over a Bible neither of them read from, a fire lit at dusk the way her people once did, rings exchanged the way his people always had. Voss stood as witness. Half the valley came. Years later, when travelers passed through that valley and asked about the rebuilt barn standing taller and stronger than the one that burned, the old-timers would tell them the story, of the banished woman and the rancher who chose her, of the night fire nearly took everything and instead gave 2 broken people back to each other. They would point to the mantel inside that farmhouse, where a silver button and a gold ring still sat side by side in an old wooden box, and say, "That's what mercy looks like, when it finally comes home." And on quiet evenings, when the light went long and orange over the ridge the way it had the night the riders first came, Ethan and Little Fawn would sit together on that porch, watching the horizon, 2 figures at rest against a sky finally, fully at peace.